right now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to eLearnChat, where everything, and we mean everything, is about talk. Talk is knowledge. And here we are. We're having a good day today. We're having Skype issues and all sorts of fun. Anyway, I'm Rick Zanotti, and welcome to the show. Joining me from, actually, the government shut down here, so she decided to go to D.C. right at that moment. Here is Dawn Mahoney.
Here's the headlines from today's paper in Washington, D.C.
Shutdown day. No big loss. Anyway.
We're glad to be here. I can't wait to introduce my friend and colleague from Ireland. Fiona Quigley is with us to talk about storytelling. Isn't that going to be great?
Storytelling. Well, okay, Fiona, how are you today?
I'm good apart from connection issues, so I apologize if you lose me. Hopefully it'll be okay.
So, Fiona,
we're glad you're here.
What's your story?
What is story?
What is your story?
My story. My story is I'm an e-learning designer and video producer. I've been probably in this game as long as both of you guys are, but you guys look a lot more youthful than I do.
I'll bet your money I'm older than both of you.
Lisa just joined us.
The check's in the post for that one. But yeah, I mean, I have a fairly eclectic background in terms of into this field. I started as a computer scientist, programming in COBOL, and studied computer sciences in the 90s. And I suppose that was back in a time when it wasn't really that cool to be geeky. So I was kind of born at the wrong time into that world. And then I eventually meandered into teaching and training. So I'm all about technology. I'm all about helping people to learn and really helping people to get to good understanding of what they need to learn.
That's good. Now, Fiona, just so you know, I started my first computer class in 72. So,
right.
So I've been around a little longer, I think. And I was a computer guy. Spent almost 25 years in the computer industry. So
it's interesting that the shift in the change that's happened even in the last 10 years in terms of programming languages, right, what you can do on the internet. It's just been phenomenal. And even from when I graduated, the shift in the paradigms, it's just amazing, So if you couple that with what's going on in the workplace and how the shift in learning is taking place, we do seem to be in a constant state of flux.
I know, that's for sure. So today you're going to talk a little bit about story. So what constitutes a story? I know you did a survey recently where you were analyzing story. What were the results of that survey?
Yeah, I mean, the results were quite interesting. I mean, just for people who maybe hadn't seen the survey, I did a little story of my dad, and I asked him to tell a story of an experience he had in childhood, and talk about his feelings, talk about the impact it had on him. And it was a little short story. It was only about 4 or 5 minutes long, and I topped and tailed it with some video and audio, just to kind of set the scene. And I asked people some very general questions. First of all, did they like the story? And actually, most of them said they did, which was quite surprising to me, because the story was quite specific to a historical context in Northern Ireland. So, even though you may not understand the gist of a story, you can connect with the speaker, you can connect with the emotional experience. And stories are generally kind of that sort of universal type of attention grabbing or attention seeking sort of behavior. But other things that came up from it was that some people didn't like the story because they thought it was too emotional and they thought it was too long. And other people didn't like it because they thought that it wasn't relevant to their needs, and that's the sort of thing I would have expected. But overall, 70% of people actually said they liked the story, even though it wasn't really maybe relevant to their culture.
No, what I found interesting is that I didn't quite know what he was talking about
exactly
all the time. However, I found him engaging.
Yeah, I did too.
And a lot of the research that I've done myself, is kind of separating out content of story from the speaker, and it seems to be that the more engaging the speaker is, it doesn't necessarily matter what they're talking about, but if the speaker is authentic and credible and has a little vulnerability, that tends to tell any story well.
Well, I keep joking, that's why you listen to politicians. They say nothing, but they're engaging.
Yeah,
so it's pretty good.
Yeah, well, that's slightly worrying, but anyway. So yeah, I mean, the results of the story survey. I mean, it was a very impromptu survey. There wasn't a lot of kind of scientific rigor behind it, and I do intend to go and do some more rigorous surveys. But I mean, certainly, it was about the speaker. It was about the connection the speaker made, and he's just. This is my point about stories. This guy, my dad, is just an ordinary, everyday, Joe Soap. He can tell a little bit of a story, a little bit of a yarn. And there's lots of people in lots of companies who maybe are not getting a chance to tell their story and kind of show the things that they know and the things that they can teach others. And I think if we could do a little bit more of that, simple engagement in companies, it actually would help unlock some potential.
So one of the questions that just came in the chat pod is, how are you defining an engaging speaker? So I thought your father was very compelling. I wanted to listen to more.
Yeah, you know what, that's such a super question, and it's actually something I've been grappling with myself. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Brené Brown. I think she's from the university. Yeah. So she talks a lot about vulnerability and courage and authenticity, and I think that's what an engaging speaker is. They're not people who stand up and are gurus and know everything about everything. They're ordinary human beings who have vulnerability and who can tell stories that people can relate to. And I think that's my dad's story, actually. That was it. It was about a particular political situation in Northern Ireland and the impact it had on him, but it was also about a little boy leaving home, which a lot of people can relate to. And what I'll do after the show is I'll put up the link to that story just in case people don't have a context for it, in case they haven't seen it.
That'd be great. You said authenticity and humility?
Vulnerability. Authenticity, vulnerability, and I would say probably credibility.
Absolutely.
If you start telling a story that sounds as if it's too good to be true, or is based on a lie, people will switch off. Now, that's not.
I know in my organization, our now CEO, he was the chief legal counsel before he was named CEO, and he goes to the Leadership Academy. We hold every month with new leaders, and he tells a story about when he made a tremendous error working for another company, and he cannot get through the story without tearing up, and he's probably told that story hundreds of times.
Yeah, and that's a great example, Dawn. Stories are very deep-rooted for people, because essentially that's how we make sense of our world, is we tell both ourselves stories and we tell our stories to other people. So it's really kind of our deep emotional root. That's where stories come from.
Now, do you find, Fiona, that in today's day and age, we're losing, in family structures and everything else, we're losing that generational storytelling? Not to mention the storytelling inside a corporation or a government agency. There's not a lot of storytelling going on.
No, and you're dead right, Rick. I was very lucky. I was brought up here in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, and the oral tradition was still very, very common, And in fact, we used to joke about my dad. We used to call him Charles Ingalls. His name is Charles, but he was always telling stories and parables. And every time we asked him a question, we just rolled our eyes, because he would answer it with a parable. He would never give us a right or a wrong answer. So yeah, I mean, they are being lost. And what's really interesting to me is that the uprise of the likes of social media and Twitter and so on. I mean, that's filling that hole. That's allowing people to tell stories. But I still think we need to tell them using the oral tradition as well. I think we need to get that back into our companies. I mean, essentially, a lot of the time, we're not getting a lot of time to have conversations in companies. We're sending people emails who sit next to us.
Right.
or text messages, to someone who's in another room, and simply bringing in a little bit of storytelling using a lunch and learn lunchtime session of someone telling a success story in a project. I mean, that could help a lot.
No,
Well,
that's
engaging
true.
our heads and our hearts, and being a little vulnerable in front of our associates, I don't think is ever a bad thing.
No, and in fact,
Yeah.
it's sort of interesting. I remember my very first job, my manager said, "Kid, let me tell you about what happens here in the bank." And next thing you know, we had stories going on, and it was a pretty good way to translate his experiences into what we might experience. And so it was fairly effective, and I guess I was lucky in that respect. And my second big job, I guess, were very similar. I had a storytelling boss, and it was sort of interesting because as a result, you got into the culture much more quickly.
When you can link your learning to a story much more easily than you can trying to memorize a list
Yep.
or something.
Yeah, I think there was a psychologist in the 70s, Jerome Bruner. He did some experiment around narrative learning, and he said that if you base facts around a story, you learn them 20% or 20 times quicker. And I don't know if there's been more research done on that, but I mean, that certainly was his findings.
Well, it's
Well, I
interesting
think
because that again.
the research especially calls attention to the retention of the knowledge is that in 30 days you can, if it's linked to a story that you can relate to, you remember it better in 30 days than you would if you were just doing rote learning. And I attended the ASTD Learn with the Best yesterday, Learn from the Best, and there was the person that wrote the book, What Makes Your Brain Work. I think I have the title correct. He talked about the brain and learning and linkage, and stories played prominently in his discussion yesterday as well, especially for retention.
It's interesting. I mean, I think there was a guy, is it John Medina, has written that book on 12 brain rules, and he talks about emotion, and that if you trigger emotion, it acts like a save button in the brain. And I think that's essentially what stories are doing. They're getting saved, they're getting anchored very strongly in the brain because they're sparking emotion.
Well, that's why music is so popular. When you look at modern songs or any kind of song, the lyrics usually trigger an emotion. And you can, if you notice, if you listen to a song from your youth and you hear it now, it will trigger a lot of the same emotions you felt back then. It's really rather fascinating.
Yeah, and they also transport you exactly back to that moment, where you're at. And, if we could do that for all learning experiences, wouldn't that be fabulous?
Mm-hmm.
Right, if you would have a smell memory, a visual memory.
Oh, no, Dawn, not smell-o-vision, please.
And what he, the saying, his name is, David Rock is the author, not Chris Rock. David Rock said that he uses this saying, did you make the hippo sing? And he's the whole linkage of the amygdala and the hippocampus in your brain, when they're both triggered through a learning event, that's how your retention happens. And you have to have the emotions and the sensory memory in order for it to make the hippo sing. Which I thought was kind of fun.
And yet it's interesting, in learning, in most corporations, humor, emotion are completely taken out of most learning, to the point where most learning is decided useless.
Yeah, which is really interesting, because all of the really, I always maintain all of the really good ways that we learn as children. And then once we go into the workplace, it's like going from colour to black and white. Mm-hmm. And all of the good learning techniques that we have learned, they just go out the window. And it's nearly like, if I could make up 10 rules how not to help people learn, it would be every modern workplace these days. Right,
but a lot of the problem with that is people are afraid of lawsuits. They're afraid of, what if I hurt somebody's feelings? What if this? What if that? So they talk themselves into complete non-action. As a result, learning tends to be completely not very useful. There are exceptions, obviously, but in many cases, it's just not very useful.
Yeah, it's kind of the path of least resistance, just to tick a few boxes and so on. But I mean, stories can still overcome that. I think we can bend stories into our normal workplace learning. We can do lunch and learns. We can do lessons learned from projects. It doesn't have to be a complete revolution, because often if you try and throw the baby out with the bathwater, people are going to resist. But I think generally bringing in little anecdotes, little scenarios now and then, really would get the oral tradition back into our workplaces.
And there's a robust chat in the chat room, and Leva brings this up about you have to have lived the story in order to be authentic and credible. And so how do we kind of get people to that place where they're not making stuff up and they're not faking it till they make it, and they feel comfortable, if that's the right word, and okay to be in that vulnerable place to tell stories? What's been your experience?
Simple answer is role modeling, is having lots of people do it and then having people learn from it. You know, I mean, I was very lucky in quite a few jobs, just like you, Rick. You know, I learned through people telling stories of their successes and failures and so on. So I think it's having lots of different people telling different stories, and it's also encouraging people to talk about their journey. You know, it's not always telling a story about how you achieve something. It's about telling stories as you go along.
Did we lose your audio?
Yeah, sorry, it's cutting out a
Sorry,
little bit.
that was my fault.
That's okay.
I muted.
Okay.
I was muted. Yeah, you're right. When you talk about story, it's something that evolves. You know, stories have a beginning and end, but not in a business environment or a governmental agency or any kind of work environment. It's kind of an ongoing story. There are smaller stories within the ongoing story. And you brought up a good point. How do you capture that?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of capturing it. You know, you can formalize it if you want, but some of my experiences with formalizing storytelling is it tends to change it in the same way as, you know, all these years we've been formalizing learning, and really it's informal learning where it's at. So it's introducing it into things like team meetings and, you know, different sessions like that into the natural workplace flow. You know, encouraging people to tell stories in social media, through social learning, you know, that sort of stuff. But I would say, you know, caution definitely about formalizing storytelling, because it tends to give you a certain type of story, which is fine, but you know, we learn informally and we learn as we go, and if we can get storytelling to work like that, then I think that's the best way.
Now, what do you think of the role of video and audio, for that matter, but video in terms of telling stories rather than just trying to do simulations or having a more static kind of story where we repeat it, have somebody on video talking about their things? Do you think that's more effective?
Yeah, I quite like it, but I tell you what I do like is I like the conversation. I like someone being interviewed. Number one, it's easier to tell a story when people are asking you questions, because then you're accessing your tacit knowledge to try and answer those questions. I think not everyone will find it easy to sit in front of a camera and just tell a story. So immediately you're creating barriers. So I'm all for making it as easy and natural as possible for people to tell stories. But I also think, you know, using text and images are every bit as effective with little snippets of video. You know, let's not turn this into a Hollywood production. You know, these are stories to capture very quick learning, make it natural, make it within the, you know, the flow of people's work. So let's not create too many barriers, I think.
I think a lot of people are scared to put video in because they're worried that they have to make it a Hollywood production. So that's a good point. Moments of video are impactful.
You know, one of the most effective stories I ever captured was from, I do a lot of work in healthcare, and I captured a lady telling her story of her journey through cancer. And we literally placed the camera in front of her for about an hour, and it was just an interview. Whenever she stopped, we asked a few questions to get her going again. And all we did through that hour was we pulled out maybe a couple of minutes snippets here and there, but most of it was text, and most of it was some images as well of family members and so on. And then we used that story for healthcare professionals to create a little bit of empathy and realise that, you know, the journey of the patient and maybe some improvement in service and how patients were treated. And, you know, in all, I mean, that might have taken us half a day's work. Whereas if we were doing a full production and editing that down, it ended, you know, into about 3 days' work. So I think we need to be careful about the methods that we use to capture stories and capture them, you know, efficiently and effectively.
I know in my work with senior housing, one of the most requested speakers we have as an organization is someone who works in our customer service. She's a manager there, and she has a story about take good care of my mom. Her mom is a dementia resident and has been for quite a long time, and there's nothing better that we can do for our new associates is to have them participate with that discussion, because then it makes it real.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that the story isn't the end of it. The story is the spark, the catalyst that you want people to look at to drive change, and it doesn't need a whole lot of structure to do that. And again, we sometimes in this industry we want to package things up and wrap a bow around it, but tell a simple story using text or graphics or some video snippets. Let your team look at, let them draw their conclusions, and that's a nice little lesson.
Well, it's the best way to make, in quotes, digital learning or e-learning, especially for, in quotes, soft subjects, that we want the heart and emotion to enter. That's how we make it different and better, I think, than just, clicking buttons here and clicking next. By putting those pieces of story in, gets them to re-engage with the content, then we're winning all the way around.
Yeah, and it's a different way of I suppose focusing people's attention. This is real people's lives. These are real scenarios. This isn't just about some abstract list of do's and don'ts. It has an impact on people, and that's what story gives us. It's not just the emotion; it's the consequences and the impact it has on people.
Well, and Mary wrote in the chat pod earlier that how much better compliance-based training that we have so much of could be better by the use of stories, because then it takes that mandatory you must, you shall, you must pieces and puts them back in place and why we're doing this.
Right, but compliance is one of the issues usually where you have a lot of legal review and stories get taken out. Anything that could smack of anything gets taken out. That's real common. We've done a ton of compliance, and usually you wind up hitting a wall pretty quickly. Great ideas, and then they get immediately whacked down.
Yeah, I know that I could sell that. I wouldn't have any trouble.
Yeah, maybe. Again, it's your environment probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've just finished a project which was compliance training for bank, college, and library staff on customer service for deaf and blind people, and we did it all through stories. We had deaf and blind customers actually tell their story of what it was like to go into a bank and not being treated fairly, and it was very, very powerful. Now, we did some summaries of do's and don'ts as well, but it was 90% through storytelling that we did it.
And let's face it, they're they're engaging with the content in a whole other way as well, so it would be needed instead of just having screen readers and audio.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I suppose it's anything really to stand out. I think maybe that a lot of the e-learning that has been produced in the last 10 years, we do need something different. We do need to humanize it, which is ironic saying it's online learning, but stories certainly do humanize it, and certainly make the consequences a lot more impactful for people watching it.
It's interesting. One of the simplest things you can do for e-learning, which isn't done all that often, is change the voice. Make it you. You're talking to the person rather than we, mm-hmm. And who's we?
We and they.
We and they, but make it you. Make it personal. Make it something that gets their attention, that they're engaged with, that they are part of. Because the we is a very abstract concept. Who is we? What is we? Is we me? Is it me plus you? What is we? And it's a simple thing, but from a writing perspective, we don't need to sanitize the writing to the point that it is so impersonal that there is no story, there's no personal connection with the training. And so that's a small change that you can make that starts making it a little bit more of a story, is by bringing it to them.
Yeah, I can't think of any content area that wouldn't benefit from having story and relationships.
No.
Yeah, I mean, and the other aspect of story is around narrative, and I kind of see story and narrative as being two different things. A story is, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and as we've been talking about today, stories are ongoing. Narratives are ongoing, and if you become aware of the narratives in your organisation, then you can start to figure out, well, are the stories I'm telling helpful? Is it, are my stories glass half full? Or not. And one big example of this recently has been, the work around women in business. Different stories are now being told, and certainly the Lean In book by the Facebook lady, which I've forgotten her name. She is trying to tell a different narrative around women in business. She's not accepting the fact that 95% of the world's companies are being run by women, are not being run by women. She's getting women to tell different stories of the challenges that they have overcome to make their career successful. And by starting to change the narrative and change stories, then you actually can bring about change in the workplace.
Well, I think narrative speaks so strongly to another industry buzz or whatever, as far as knowledge management, as our baby boomers are retiring at such a terrifically fast rate. That's how I see that being powerful in the usage of narrative.
Yeah, I suppose the challenge with that, Dawn, is that they tried to do a lot of work on knowledge management in the 90s around capturing what they called tacit knowledge, and what they found when they did that was that it was so complicated and complex and time consuming. It didn't necessarily work for a lot of companies, but I'm just wondering now, with our better digital technologies and rapid capture, I wonder will that work better these days? I would hope it would.
You could use your smartphone to videotape somebody doing a stream of consciousness conversation as they're exiting or planning their exit strategy, and then go and figure out how you make it data driven. But there shouldn't be any reason why we aren't capturing this knowledge, at least a basic format.
Yeah, and maybe in another generation time we'll be wondering how we archive and find all our Facebook stories, because essentially, the likes of Facebook and Twitter, those are narratives, those are story platforms. But yeah, I think that the technology is finally around, that it should make knowledge capture, knowledge management, and narrative, learning a lot more efficient and easy to do.
And how much better to learn from somebody giving instruction that's been there, done that, versus here's a list of steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, if we're aware of the stories we're telling, the point I was making about narrative, we could be telling stories that are not that helpful. When you come home from work and you have a bad day, and the boss has done everything and to cause that bad day. But then if you keep on telling that story, then it gets worse and worse and worse. But if we're more aware of the story we're actually telling ourselves, then we can start to change the narrative and improve things.
So Fiona,
we're in charge of that.
Fiona, what would you consider, for somebody who is newer at writing, who hasn't really thought about story, what would you consider a good starting point for them to consider when creating, let's say, an e-learning piece, and developing a storyboard or developing the instructional design?
Yeah, I would say purpose. First of all, why are you wanting to tell that story? What purpose does it serve? Is it to change something in your organization? Is it to model something? Is it to give a demonstration? I'd also consider who is the best person to tell that story. Is it someone who's lived and breathed that experience, which generally is, as we have talked about today, someone who can tell that story in a very credible way. And then the other aspect is how you're going to capture it. So I'd definitely say it would be purpose, it would be who's telling it, and how you're going to capture it.
That's good. And with that, we are at the end of the show. We're also getting near the end of bandwidth, so I'm a little concerned that it's going to go. I'm looking at the bandwidth meter, and it's looking a little hazy right now.
Then we better.
Before we go, one of us or two of us disappear.
Yeah, apologies for disappearing earlier on.
Oh, no
We'll
problem.
play it.
Fiona, it's a real pleasure, and I think it's a very relevant topic to really focus on story and try to
I'd like
utilize.
us, and let's have a part 2, and you can show us some of your example because they're fabulous.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I would love to. We're launching the stories for the deafblind folks in a few weeks, so I would love to show that to you.
Are you coming to DevLearn?
Great.
Sorry, say that
Are
again?
you coming to DevLearn?
No,
Oh,
no,
okay.
no, unfortunately not, no.
That would be fun.
Yeah, she's got great examples that you'll want to take a look at, Rick.
That sounds
so,
fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yep, we'll have a part 2.
Well, Fiona, appreciate you being here. Dawn, as always. And if you're watching the recorded version, please subscribe. Give us your feedback. We love hearing from you. And if you're in the chat room, again, thanks for being there. And we will see you next week. Next week, who do we have next week? We had somebody. The name just slipped.
We have a guest. I can't think who it is at the
Yeah,
moment.
it just slipped. It's early morning over here. Anyway, we will see you next week.
Check Twitter. We'll let you know.
Oh, I know who's on next week. Paulina Kishniak from iSpring. She is
okay,
the
good.
marketing manager over there, and they've got some new releases, and she wants to talk about them. And she'll be transmitting from Yoshkar Ola, Russia, of all places. It should be fun.
Fabulous.
International show.
I want to learn more about them again.
Well, we're in Ireland today.
Sure.
We're going to go to Russia next week. Lord knows where we are the following week.
That's a truly international show, and I bet you Russia has a better connection.
No, they've had issues too, but I know Paulina has a pretty good connection. I've talked to her. So, anyway, you guys have a great one, and we will see you all next week on eLearnChat. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Oh, she's gone.